father of the internet.
Well, one of them. I mean, look, I want to be very clear about this. Some people say, Vint Cerf, father of the internet. First of all, Bob Kahn and I were two hands on one pencil. Well, that's important. But the second thing is you don't do anything on this scale unless you get a lot of help. So lesson number one, you want to do something big, get some help, preferably from people who are smarter than you are. And we were lucky. That was a low barrier, and we got a lot of help. And I want you to realize that I know that. It's fun to have been around at the very beginning, but I recognize that things like this don't happen without people like you.
So New Haven, Connecticut,
Right.
Palo Alto, Sigrid along the way.
Yes. Well, yes and no. I mean, I got up to Stanford before I met Sigrid, and then we met in Los Angeles, where she'd come from Wichita, Kansas, to become an interior designer and renderer, showing people what the designs would look like when they were done. So we met in Los Angeles, and then we went back up to Stanford when I joined the faculty in 1972. There was a fair number of years in between New Haven and Stanford. Most wonderful thing about New Haven is that I got to come back again in 2013 to receive an honorary degree from Yale. You know what they do? They walk you through the town, and then you come to the big, outdoor seating. And so my marching mate was Justice Sotomayor.
No.
So that was really something. It's cool.
How wonderful. You've influenced our lives in so many ways. What we'd love to hear is a little bit of the background on how that happened. We'd love to sponge up from you your point of view of where we are today, and then more importantly, how do we get ready for the future? In 1995, when we did our first website, we thought of it as a depiction of our store.
Okay.
So you'd come in, and on the left-hand side, you'd see the cooler and the flowers. And so we've been following the fleshing out of that image in the brands and products that we brought to our customers. And so Lisa and I were chatting about that, and we ran down the hall to Leslie's office and said, Leslie, what if we revisited that idea and had an artist do a rendering of our concept? And Leslie said, I have a meeting in 10 minutes with a company that is pitching us on this very idea, only not doing it in 2 dimensions.
They want to do it in 3. Sure.
And making it metaverse ready.
Of course.
Take us through the path of where we've been, where might we be now, help us to formulate what we should be doing to jump ahead of where the world is going.
So when Chris and Jim said, why don't you come and join us tonight, I thought, okay, you guys represent an extraordinary band of innovative people. You're entrepreneurs, you're innovative, and I thought, well, let's talk a little bit about how that comes about, especially in the context of the internet and computing and information technology. I thought about this, and I put a few things together. Now, I want to start out just by saying thank you to 1-800-Flowers. You've saved my butt so many times, I've given up trying to count.
We're proud butt savers.
Yeah, well, especially the same-day delivery, right? As you were early on to recognize that information was really valuable, especially if you could compute with it. And I started to think a little bit more about what it means when you have a lot of customers who are online. So what is it that they have to do that you get for free, in the sense that they had to provide you with this information in machinable form? Like, who are they? How are they going to pay you? What did they order? Where is it supposed to be delivered? And you accumulate all that in the normal course of someone placing an order. And then you accumulate that for bazillions of people all over the world. Just because of the way the system works, you accumulate all this information that lets you figure out, for example, who buys what from where and where does it get delivered. You begin to learn what's the market look like. It means that you've got access to all that information if you only hang on to it and make good use of it. So not only do you figure out about the people who are ordering, but you also learn about the people who are delivering, whether it's the flowers or Harry and David or something else, because you're also getting information about when things got delivered. I know, because I get an email saying your flowers have been delivered or your other product has been delivered. That information gives you a chance to assess how well the system is operating. Is it timely? Is it accurate? Which stores are really good at delivering on time, which ones aren't? So you're getting this, it's almost like some people use the term digital exhaust. It's this sort of, because of the actions that are taken online, bits are flying all over everywhere, and you get to accumulate those and do something useful with them. Even to the point where you can start to think about machine learning mechanisms, looking for patterns that you might not otherwise recognize. I was asked in an earlier conversation about what's Web 3.0. It's a marketing term. It doesn't exactly mean very much. It's somebody stuck a label on it. But what the intent is to talk about what you were just describing, which is the possibility of creating a three-dimensional environment that a user could explore in and interact with. I've always thought it was a little weird. Now, let me explain. In order to visit one of those three-dimensional things, you have to stick this thing on your head, like an Oculus Rift or something. It makes you look like Darth Vader. And all I could think of was, wait a minute, everybody's getting all excited about this, and they're saying, oh, we could meet in a room kind of like this, and we'd see each other in 3 dimensions, except the way we would look is like we're all wearing this thing on our heads. So in order to not look like that, you need to have an avatar. And so suddenly there's a whole new market. Like, what does your avatar look like? I know what mine would. It would have more hair than I do. And what's it going to wear? I just recently discovered that there's a virtual Barbie doll business that's starting to show up. And I've had a couple of pitches for people that want to make clothes that can be rented in the metaverse. So you can almost see, if this catches on, you can almost see all these different opportunities to create in virtual space the things that you have done in the physical space. So that might even mean virtual flowers. Think about virtual birthday cards and other kinds of greeting cards. That's very popular because it happens quickly, it's reliable, and you don't have to worry about stamps and going to the post office.
And it can be in the form of an NFT.
I'm not a big NFT fan, to be frank with you.
Please tell us.
I'm sorry, blockchain is not the solution to everything. Blockchain is the Brill cream of the 21st century.
There's only 2 of us understand what Brill cream is, and neither of us have hair.
We don't need it anymore. Blockchain itself as a technology is actually quite useful, and so I don't want to mislead anything. But this Bitcoin business or all the other cryptocurrencies don't have a real basis. If anything, it's the 1600s tulip craze all over again. And you started to see a little bit of that just in the recent few weeks as the air gets out from under this, because it looked like a big Ponzi scheme for all practical purposes. So I don't really see NFT as being real. The idea behind it was actually clever. Let's suppose you're an artist and you sell a painting to someone, that's it. You got that revenue and that's it. But the idea behind the NFT was that maybe when it's sold again, that you would still get some revenue, because there'd be a smart contract in the blockchain that says when this is sold again and the contract system knows it's been transferred, the transaction has happened, you get a piece of whatever that is. And if it turns out that your work increases in popularity and therefore in value, you get a stream of income from it if it keeps being sold. Of course, you don't always know how quickly your paintings will be sold and whether they'll be held or whether there'll be transactions. So you don't know for sure how that's going to work. But the idea was to try to bring an opportunity for an artist who creates a work of art or a piece of music or something else to get continuing revenue from that. So I actually think that's not a bad idea.
In your work at Google as the Internet Evangelist, which is a title we all aspire to, you're an advocate for consumers owning their own data.
Well, we think everybody should have control of their own data, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
If we didn't think that, we'd be out of business tomorrow. Think of everybody's email and spreadsheets and photographs and all that other stuff. That's theirs. And we do, as we work very hard to make sure that it stays theirs and it's not accessible to anybody else unless the person who owns it has given permission. So we encrypt everything. We encrypt it when it's at rest. We encrypt it when it's being transferred. We try to get people to use two-factor authentication so that they're, even if their passwords are compromised, they're protected. So the answer is people should have control over their information and should have the ability to say who gets access to it.
How long will we be bothered by passwords?
Well, passwords are not very useful because sometimes we all use the same one because we can remember it, or people use password as the password because it's easy to remember. Or how about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? That's the most common password known, believe it or not. So no, I'm a big two-factor authentication fan.
Mm-hmm. Is there something coming biometric or distinct, separate from passwords, that you see as an emerging technology we should be watching?
Well, you've seen fingerprint readers on, or facial recognition. You also know that facial recognition has the dark side and having to do with surveillance and things like that. I am nervous about using pure biometric as a way of identifying yourself because I want you to think a little bit about how this works. Suppose it's a fingerprint reader. Okay, so you stick your fingerprint on the reader and it digitizes your fingerprint and then it summarizes it into a shorter string. Now let's imagine that the security of the system is such that somebody gets that string, that summarized fingerprint, and has found a way to bypass the system. So when it's asking for the fingerprint, the malware just feeds the digital version of it into the system, and suddenly they're you. It's not real easy to change your fingerprint. I mean, you know. So a pure biometric, in my view, is not a really good idea.
Because there's no alternative.
There's no alternative, that's right. Mm-hmm. So, and sometimes the readers don't always work right. We use that, by the way. We use fingerprints and we use eye scans, but that's for access to our data centers. So our employees go one by one through an eye scan before they can, and a badge scan before they can get into the data center. And that's because we're trying to protect everybody's information.
A green cloud, is there such a thing?
There, absolutely. In fact, Google has worked really hard to make sure that the energy that we use to run the data centers comes from green sources. And we have 2 or 3 ways of doing that. We buy 30-year contracts for wind power or 30-year contracts for solar power. We build solar panels on our data centers and our other buildings to try to offset some of the use of energy. If necessary, we buy carbon contracts to offset whatever power generation is not green. And we're shooting, I think, for 2030 to be 100% green power at all times.
Wow,
so
that's ambitious.
Yes, but it's, you know, it's the right thing to do.
Some of us in this room were around when we were involved in Second Life.
Oh, yes. I remember that well.
The feature I liked most about Second Life was that I could have an avatar that had a furry tail, and I won't go into all the issues that come with that, but it sounds to me like the metaverse that we're talking about now looks a lot like a later-day version of Second Life.
I think that's a reasonable kind of cartoon model of what is intended in this metaverse idea. One of the big questions in my mind is whether these 3D environments are going to be compatible in some way so that you could move from one to another. The thing that makes the internet work is the standards that all the networks use in order to transmit data back and forth between all the computers.
But there's blood before there's standards.
Not necessarily. I mean, well, I was lucky because the Defense Department underwrote the cost of developing the internet. And so there wasn't any, they had all the guns, so there wasn't any fighting at all.
Yep.
People just said, you know, if you pay me, I'll help you. So.
And the early, let's do that. The early days of the internet were for university exchange of information, but it was really military application.
Well, no, actually, that's not true. No, let me help you with this. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency got started in 1958, right after the Sputnik event, when October 4, 1957, President Eisenhower said, this will not happen again. We do not want to be technologically surprised. So they started the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and their first job was to get us into space. But very quickly that got spun off to NASA because the president didn't want this to be a military thing. They wanted it to be a civilian thing. The last thing he wanted was to militarize space any more than the risk, any more than it already had been by ICBMs. So ARPA had to look for some other things to do, and one thing it decided to do was to explore artificial intelligence. This is like the 1960s. This is 1960, like 62, 63. So they started a research program on artificial intelligence with universities around the country. And every university said to DARPA, okay, you have to buy us a new world-class computer every year so we can keep doing world-class research. And even ARPA couldn't afford to do that every year. So they said, okay, we're going to build a network and you can share. Everybody hated that idea. But they said, no, we're going to build a network anyway. And they decided to use a technology which at the time was considered heresy in the communications world, packet switching. Now, most of you know what that is. It's basically electronic postcards that run, 100 million times faster than the post office does. But at the time, it was considered a crazy idea. It couldn't possibly work. AT&T refused to participate in it. They said, not going to work. We'll be happy to sell you dedicated circuits so you connect your stupid packet switches together. So they did, and we did, and it worked. So the first test was to get a bunch of different kinds of computers from IBM and HP and Digital Equipment and Xerox and what have you to interwork together over this packet switch net. That was called the ARPANET. And that worked very, very well. We had it running, did a big demo in 1972. Then my colleague, Bob Kahn, goes to ARPA, and the first thing they say is, this ARPANET thing worked pretty well, didn't it? And he said, yep. He said, can we use computers in command and control? Yeah, that sounds an interesting idea, but that means we're going to have to put computers in ships at sea, and in mobile vehicles, and in airplanes. And you can't tie the ships together with dedicated telephone circuits, and the airplanes never make it off the tarmac, and the tanks run over the wires and they break. So Bob Kahn started working on packet radio, mobile packet radio, which is what you get with your mobiles today, but this is 1973, 74. Also a packet satellite net for long distance comms for the ship to ship and ship to shore. So he shows up in my office at Stanford and he says, Vint, we have a problem. And my first reaction was, what do you mean, we? And he says, well, we're trying to figure out how to connect these different kinds of packet switch nets together to make it look uniform because they're all different. Different addressing structures, different data rates, different latencies, different error rates. But how do we make it all look like it's all one network? That was the internet problem. And it took us until about 6 months, from March until September, to figure out how to do that. Then we wrote a paper, which was published in May of '74, to describe what it would look like. Then we started building it in 1975, and the rest is history.
Where do we put our bets in terms of what metaverse, who will have a metaverse? Will it be several? Will it be standards? If we build this perfect world in a virtual sense that we then try and mimic in a real world sense, where do we put our bets? Is it Facebook's metaverse? Will it be competing metaverses? How do we anticipate where that world will go?
Well, first of all, it's hard to imagine that there won't be competing metaverses. They already exist in a number of different forms. So I imagine that the right thing to do, especially if you want to become a consumer of someone else's metaverse platform, one of the most important messages you can deliver is to say, we're not interested in your walled garden. We're interested in being able to use more than one metaverse. We want standards to allow interoperation. Now, you got that with electronic mail. There's a small story behind that. In 1983, I helped to develop this MCI mail as an electronic mail service. That electronic mail was invented way back in 1971 on the ARPANET. It was the most popular application. So I did this commercial thing for MCI. And then a few years later, I was thinking, that the email was only available to people who were on the internet. So it was universities that had contracts with the government. And the government had built 4 big backbone networks, and they connected them all together, but the whole thing was government operated and government owned. And they said, we don't want any of that commercial traffic to go on the government sponsored backbones. And so I'm thinking around 1988, how's the general public ever going to get access to this stuff if we don't build a commercial engine under it? I asked for permission to connect the MCI mail, commercial MCI mail system, to the internet in 1988. I was asked this question of the Federal Networking Council, and they said yes for a year.
Which, is it fair to say, saved the telecom industry?
Well, I hadn't quite got to that conclusion, but it might very well be the case.
Because most technologies disrupted industry. That should have disrupted the telecom industry, except
earlier.
for what you did, made them embrace the new technology, which rarely ever happens.
Well, okay, but that comes later, because what happens is that first we do the MCML connection, we announce it, all the other email providers like CompuServe and OnTime and Telemail and so on said, wait a minute, those MCI guys can't have this special privilege. We want to be on too. And the Networking Council said, okay. So they all got connected to the internet. Then they discovered that because they were connected to the internet, all of their customers could talk to everybody else's customers. So suddenly the walled gardens were penetrated. How appropriate, the walls came down, Jericho, and all that stuff. So that causes a revolution in interoperability because they adopted common standards. We couldn't get the same thing to happen with instant messaging. There's some reasons for that, and it gets complicated, but we were not able to get the instant messaging systems to adopt common standards. So now what we want to do, if we want this metaverse thing to really work like the electronic mail does, where there's lots of interoperability, plenty of opportunity to introduce a new product that competes, we have to establish standards for that. And you have to demand that. So this is what happened to networking. The original networking idea at IBM was called Systems Network Architecture. That allowed you to connect IBM machines together and work great. Digital Equipment Corporation had DECnet, and it connected Digital Equipment Corporation machines together. That was great. And HP had their own system, but none of them would talk to the other brands of computers. Well, the ARPANET project involved those different brands of computers. So the customers of those companies said to them, we aren't buying your computers unless they run this internet protocol so I can use more than one brand of machine. And so that's where we want to go with the metaverse. We want multiple systems to interwork with each other. So we have the flexibility, you have the flexibility to explore anybody's metaverse for purposes of introducing products and services and, and serving your customers.
And Vint, who would be the governing body there?
Well, that could turn out to be an industry consortium. It doesn't necessarily have to be a government-sponsored thing. I mean, there are international organizations like the International Standards Organization or the International Telecommunications Union. Those are true international organizations, but there are some that are implicit, like the Internet Engineering Task Force is run by the Internet Society, and that's a private sector nonprofit. And there are other cases like 3G, 4G, 5G, and 6G, and often you find industry consortia that are doing that. So that might very well turn out to be how that turns out.
I'm going to ask Jason John. Where's Jason?
I guess my question was, from the very beginning, what surprised you of how the internet turned out, or what would you say is your biggest surprise as far as where it evolved to?
So I think there were two early surprises. I mentioned that email got invented in 1971. And I thought that what would happen is the travel budgets would drop because you didn't have to travel anymore. You didn't have to be even awake at the same time. Send a message, they answer it when they're awake, and you look at it when you're awake. And so what that meant was that we could work on projects that covered more time zones. And so I thought the travel budget would go down. 4 years later, we looked at the travel budget. It went up by a factor of 4. And so we're sitting here saying, okay, how did that happen? And the answer was, we really could handle bigger projects over more time zones, but occasionally we actually had to get together face-to-face in the same time zone. And so there were more people traveling longer distances as a consequence of that. So that was a little counterintuitive. I think the other big surprise came, for me anyway, when the World Wide Web shows up. So this, it starts in 1989. Tim Berners-Lee is doing his Inquire Within at CERN. Then in 1991, he announces that he's got the World Wide Web running on a Next machine, and nobody notices except for a couple of guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina. And they say, wow, this is really cool, but it's all text. What if it had a graphical user interface? So they invent Mosaic. This makes the internet look like a magazine with formatted text and imagery and eventually streaming audio and video. So everybody sees that and they download it 1 million times in 2 weeks. Jim Clark, the guy that started Silicon Graphics, takes one look at that and says there's a there. He goes off to the National Center for Supercomputer Applications in Champaign, Urbana, and brings them back to the Silicon Valley and starts Netscape Communications in 1994. They go public in 1995. The stock goes through the roof. It starts the dot boom. Anything that looks like it might have something to do with the internet gets money from the venture capital guys until April of 2000, when a whole lot of young entrepreneurial CEOs didn't understand the difference between revenue and capital. Capital is finite and revenue is supposed to keep going. And they ran out of capital and wondered what happened. So the landscape is littered with dead businesses. But some of them that got started during that period survived, like Google, 1998, started without a real business model.
Some of the things that Google's working on now that we might not know about.
Well, if I told you, I'd get in trouble.
Oh, go
But
ahead.
there are some things that we're spending.
Autonomous vehicles.
Yes, we split up, we're now called Alphabet, and one of the big companies is Google inside of that. So Waymo is our self-driving car thing. I've actually taken a ride in a self-driving car, and I left my fingerprints in the back seat there. It just takes off and there's nobody at the wheel. It actually ran extremely well. It was a half-an-hour ride around the Phoenix area, and it negotiated left turns that had no traffic signals. It negotiated a left turn that had a flashing yellow left arrow. And I confess that was the first time I'd ever seen a flashing yellow left arrow, and I remember thinking, what does that mean? And it means it's okay to make the left turn if there isn't anybody coming in your direction. So the car figures all that out. Mm-hmm. And so I came away very impressed. But I will tell you that some people will claim, I won't name any names, but there are some people who will claim this is easy and it's around the corner. We have probably spent more than a decade working on this problem. And it would be easy if the only cars on the road were the self-driving cars that had algorithms that they could, that were reliable.
That would behave rationally.
And yes, exactly. And the problem is they're humans, and they don't behave rationally. So figuring out how to deal with that is hard. So we're very interested, though, generally in machine learning and artificial intelligence. We've seen how powerful it can be. We've also seen how it can be brittle. It can break. And so it's amazingly deep and narrow, but it's also brittle. So it comes to wrong conclusions sometimes.
Well, we're going to go next to Jim Canavino, who has a question about outer space. Why is it that everybody who makes a few $250 million or a couple of $250 billion worth of stock feels an obligation to invest in space? And you're doing a lot of work around intergalactic communications. Why should we care? Jim, what did you want to ask?
What are we going to do with communications and speed? And entangled particles make an interesting observation of their faster than light speed communication. And what do you think that's going to have to do in the future of internet?
It's just there's tens of thousands of networks that are all operating all by them, independently, but they all use the same standards, and that's the only reason such a thing would work. And then here's something else that's starting to happen, which is huge investment in undersea cable, optical fiber cable. We build some of our own cables now because it's affordable. But the point I want to make is that connectivity, intercontinental connectivity, is extremely rapidly growing. Even islands in the middle of the Pacific and Atlantic are starting to get optical fiber connections. Then there's the low Earth orbiting satellite stuff, the Starlinks and the O3b and OneWeb and Kuiper. those are going to make it impossible to avoid access to the internet. Every square inch of the surface of the planet will be accessible. And that's actually important from your point of view, because if you can get to literally everywhere, anywhere, anytime, then you have an almost immediate opportunity to interact with your customers.
What percentage of the population of the Earth? 7 billion, is it?
There's 7.5 billion now, yes.
And what percentage of our population has access?
60% right now. And so we still have a ways to go, which, by the way, is why you still need internet evangelists. By the way, I didn't ask for that
It's
title.
self-promotion, come on.
Yeah, well, yeah, I didn't actually ask for the title. I had, MCI, some of you know, was acquired by WorldCom, and it went bankrupt in 2002, and some of us stayed around and put it back together and sold it to Verizon. And so I sent an email to Eric Schmidt, whom I'd known forever. He was then CEO of Google. I said, "Hi, Eric, do you want some help?" He sent a note back saying, "Yes, that was my job interview." So then I was talking to Larry and Eric and Sergey, and they said, "What title do you want?" And I said, "How about Archduke?" I thought that would be a great title. And they went away, and then they came back and they said, "The previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated
Didn't
in
work out so well.
1914, and it started World War I. Maybe that's a bad title. Why don't you be our chief internet evangelist?" And I said, "Okay, I could do that." But the point here is that you actually have to go out there, as I have been, except during the COVID period, to try to persuade governments to adopt policies that will encourage investment in the infrastructure that's needed to build the internet and all the training that's needed either to operate it or to use it. And so there's still a lot of work to be done to make this reliably useful for people, especially in the rural parts of the world where infrastructure is hard to come by. So yes, there has to be evangelists still.
So why interplanetary?
Everybody's following the Internet of Things, right? Devices that are programmable and can speak to the internet and to each other. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I have to tell you that one of my favorite is the internet-enabled refrigerator. And can you imagine if you had an RFID tag on everything that's in the refrigerator, it would know what it has in it. So while you're off at work, it's going through the internet finding recipes that it knows it could make. And when you come home, it's got this display of things. And it just sounded pretty cool. And then I learned that the Japanese had developed an internet-enabled bathroom scale. You step on the scale and it figures out which family member you are based on your weight, and it transmits that to the doctor, and it becomes part of your medical record, which sounds perfectly okay, except for one problem. The internet or the refrigerator is on the same network. And so you come home and you see diet recipes coming up on the display. Or maybe it just refuses to open because it knows it's just a bad idea. The other thing that really struck me, when the picture frames first came out, somebody came running into my office saying, "Vint, have you seen the internet-enabled picture frame?" And I'm sitting here thinking, that sounds about as useful as an electric fork, But it's turned out to be wonderful, right? You get to see the grandchildren growing up every day. Your kids send you pictures of the grandchildren. You get up and have a cup of coffee and see what they're doing. So there is a real interplanetary, not intergalactic. We haven't even gotten. We're not even doing interstellar yet. Interplanetary. There's a real one. It got started in 1998. So in 1997. The Pathfinder robot landed on Mars, and it had been preceded by 20 years of failure. Remember in 1976, the Viking landers arrived, 2 of them, and then nothing works, and then 97, the Pathfinder robot lands successfully on Mars. So a bunch of us got together at the Jet Propulsion Lab the next spring and said, what should we be doing now, that is 1998, that we're going to need 25 years from now?
Vint, the Jet Propulsion Lab has never called me and asked me to help on anything. Not once.
I don't know. Can I get your card? So we started working on an interplanetary internet. And you can see now that a bunch of landers have landed on Mars since that 1997 success. Every one of them has been running a prototype of the interplanetary protocols. We put them up there in 2004. Spirit and Opportunity landed on Mars in January of 2004. And they're supposed to transmit data back directly from the surface of Mars to the Deep Space Network, big 70-meter dishes in Canberra, Australia, Madrid, Spain, and Goldstone, California. So they're supposed to transmit directly back to Earth at 28.5 kilobits a second. And the scientists are grumpy about that. The radios overheat. And so the engineers say, well, we're going to back off on the radio because we don't want it to damage the radio or the instruments on board. Now the scientists are really grumpy. Then one engineer says, hey, there's an X-band radio on the rovers, and we sent orbiters 2 years before to map the surface of Mars to figure out where the rover should go. But they both had X-band radios, so they said, could we upload the prototype interplanetary software on the rovers and the orbiters? And we said, sure. So we did. And so the data now goes, and has been since 2004, goes from the rover to an overhead orbiter when it gets overhead, and it holds on to the data until it gets to the right place in its orbit, and it transmits it back to the Deep Space Net. And it does it at 128 kilobits a second because the orbiters are closer to Mars than Earth is, and the orbiters have bigger antennas and more power than a little radio on the rover. So we've been sending data back literally since 2004 on the interplanetary prototypes. The full-up system is standardized now. It's on the International Space Station, and we're ready to go with the Artemis mission when we return to the moon in the mid-2020s. So that's what it's going to look like in 2050. There really will be an interplanetary backbone operation.
And why is space so important to us? Why is Jeff Bezos and
Elon Musk?
Musk.
Elon thinks that we should be a multi-planet species because he's worried that we're going to screw up Earth. Of course, the rest of us are worried that if we get to Mars, we'll screw that up too.
We are a planet of frogs, I guess.
Have you know about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI? You know, it's this big antenna that's trying to listen to radio signals and try to find one that sounds coherent. Have you noticed that the antennas are all pointed away from Earth? We haven't found any intelligence on this planet, so we're hoping to find some out there.
We're so lucky to have you in our lives, Chris and I are, and now to be able to share you with our team. Press us. What should we be putting at the center of our pad in terms of things we're thinking about? How do we stay ahead of things? Where should we be putting our intellectual capital, our physical capital, to serve people in this boring task of having more and better relationships in their life?
Sounds like a terrible idea to me. Why would anybody want that?
Okay, change the plan, guys. Get the new pad out.
So two things immediately occur to me. One of them, back to an earlier comment about the information that you have about your customers, whether it's the companies that supply the products to the end users who order it through 1-800, or it's the customers themselves or the suppliers. The more information you have about the way they work that you can analyze, the better off you'll be to optimize the business. And now, as we start moving into this virtual environment, the idea of having virtual products that match in some way the physical ones feels like there's a there. To give you a very concrete example, think about the difference between printed books and electronic books. And if you haven't noticed, people buy both. It's not like just one or the other. People like the feel of a book, you know, and you can write in it and all that other stuff. But if you're like me and you're reading more than one book at a time, the last thing you want to do is to carry a bunch of books under your shoulder.
Which not too long ago we did.
We did, but now we don't have to anymore.
We can listen to the audio version.
We can listen to it, or we can read it on our laptops or our pads or our mobiles. So when you start thinking about the possibility of virtual products in some way matching the physical ones, that's kind of interesting. There is something intriguing about that. And the fact that the virtual products are derived from software means that you can do things with them that you couldn't do with the real product, like evolve it in some way. I mean, think about the possibility of a virtual bouquet that has the property that it changes over time depending on the seasons or the celebratory calendar, or, I mean, why not invent things like that to take advantage of the software base that gives them their flexibility, their mutability?
And you challenged Chris and I recently to think about when people come into our virtual Harry and David shop, that they can walk out back into our orchards and see where the product came
That would
from.
be really cool. That would be really cool.
Vint, you've been inspiring us for about 35 years now, and I look forward to the next 35. Thank you for spending,
Well,
Sigrid,
thank you
thank you
very
for
much.
spending time with our team.